Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to wait another minute or two and let more people join as we're just at the top of the hour. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I'm going to go through the introduction, and then we'll get started with today's session. So once again, welcome to TBR's webinar series. Today, I'm Allan Krans. I'll be starting in on the presentation and then joined by my colleagues in the cloud and software practice. That's Nicole Catchpole, Jack McElwee, and Catie Merrill. And the topic of today's discussion is a look at a business model change and how cloud is becoming higher touch. So before we get started, just a couple things to keep in mind. At the bottom of your screen, there's a series of buttons from left to right. You can access the slides, audio controls, submit Q&A, look at the speaker bios, and participate in the survey. After the webinar, you'll get an email with a replay link to go back and listen again or share with colleagues. And you can also register for other TBR webinars. Any questions as we go through the session, please submit them through the Q&A widget. And you can also always email us afterwards. Webinars@tbri.com is a good email address, but you have our contact information as well. So with that, we will jump in and get started with today's session. So as we look at this topic from a high level, we're going to dig into some of the business model shifts in terms of what customers are using cloud for and the ramifications that has in a couple of different ways. I'll start in with a look at digital transformation supported by cloud and what customers are looking for there and how vendors are trying to cater to a need for a higher touch model, even in light of some of the challenges that everyone is dealing with today. Secondly, Jack will go through some of the ways that hybrid cloud and use cases like IoT, where a lot of technology is being integrated together, is moving towards a higher touch model for the solutions as well as a vendor strategy for go-to-market. And then lastly, Nikki will finish with a look at how managed services is filling some of the role that customers need for ongoing support and more of a hands-on type engagement to help them operate and get the advantages from the solutions that they're adopting. So when we kind of take a step back, obviously all of this is happening in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the challenges that is bringing. And so in a lot of ways, just as the types of solutions and workloads that customers are looking to deploy on cloud require a higher touch model, delivery model, support model from vendors, it's the most challenging time in which to deliver that with all of the disruptions, social distancing, work from home. It's really kind of thrown a wrench in a market that for a long time has been fairly transactional, hands-off, but over the last couple of years certainly has become a space that requires a lot more upfront consulting, design, assistance, really throughout the life cycle, ending with managed services. Part of the driver for that is when we look at what's being deployed on cloud, lift and shift activity is still occurring for some customers, but it's really not the focus. They've shifted to really looking at how they can modernize IT process as well as change business process to take advantage of new technologies that are available in the attributes of being continuously updated, continuously adding innovation into those platforms, as well as being able to adapt a lot more quickly to new lines of business, new go-to-market approaches, and new streams of revenue for customers. So it's not just about the cost savings certainly anymore, and to get at that deeper value, business model changes are required. And so in that context, the upfront consulting to help customers plan and execute on that journey has become more challenging with the restrictions. And really, I think we're at the beginning of that. If we look at some of through the end of the first quarter, for a lot of the kind of hard financial data that vendors release, a lot of existing projects were able to be completed, rolled out, and gone live. However, for initiating new engagements, things that were midstream, a lot of the impacts that we have here on the left-hand side in terms of COVID-19's impact on digital transformation and larger reaching IT projects are in play. Not every industry has been impacted in the same degree. It's not kind of a universal economic slowdown. It really depends on the industry, the geography, the business model for a lot of these end customers in terms of their reaction. On the far end of the spectrum, obviously harder hit industries have gone into pretty quick budget freezes, layoffs, reductions, those types of things. Those are still at the early days, we think. Because of a lot of the stimulus that has been going on, it's masked some of the financial pain for a lot of industries and organizations, at least in the short term. So we think that will continue throughout the course of this year and certainly impact the adoption strategies for more and more organizations as we go forward. Really, the more common one is project delays. For those midstream projects, anything that didn't add value in the immediate aftermath and reaction to COVID-19 for a lot of customers was put on hold. So obviously there's ramifications for the consulting streams that would have been generated had the world continued as the environment continued as normal, as well as the cloud services revenue streams across really all spectrum of cloud offerings, from applications to infrastructure and platform. There's certainly a sense of uncertainty as you look across most organizations that's slowing their adoption of new technologies. However, on the back end of this, we are noting a lot of cultural change as well as a reinforcement of the value digital transformation and cloud services can provide within organizations. So those two things combined, we think will have a net positive effect longer term for customers to have the culture aligned around the adoption of new technologies, and also the kind of business case for not just generating new value, but also having a more agile stance, I think, is something that's come across in a lot of discussions, because there is a sense that certainly this was a challenge, but there'll be future challenges that are still uncertain and unknown. And so having a model where they can react more quickly and leverage cloud services to not have as much overhead and upkeep on their plates can really position them to react more quickly and have a better outcome for the next challenge that we'll face. So if we look at within that context of higher touch workloads moving to cloud, and some of the struggles given the current environment, when we look at the business models for some of the leading vendors that we look at, we've kind of ranked them from top to bottom by a dependence upon transformational activity versus transactional. And it's not perfect, but it gives a good perspective for, at the top of the scale, really the SaaS vendors and those that are focused on supporting business functions are the most dependent upon those further reaching IT and business transformations to be able to sell in with their offerings and have customers get the full benefit of them. There is a lot of carryover kind of float from the prior activity. Most vendors on the top have at least 60 to 70% of their revenue through subscription means. So it's not, they still have some level of support, but definitely the slowdown in new activity is going, because of a lot of things that we've gone through, will take its toll throughout the course of the end of this year as well as into next. In the middle of the spectrum, it's kind of a mixed model for the platform companies, Amazon and Google, where certainly they saw an increase in consumption from customers, certain workloads supporting remote work and digital collaboration have increased the transactional side of their revenue base. But in some ways, they have become more dependent upon the transformation and supporting new deployment models for application services. And so they're kind of in the middle of the spectrum in terms of the impact and the mix of transformation dependency as well as being able to take advantage of transactional opportunities. And then lastly, with ServiceNow and Microsoft, in some ways they're aligned to some of the shifts that customers needed to go through. And so there has been a net benefit in terms of supporting with scalable services some of that short-term reaction, and so some upside benefit through the current state. And really, longer term, they are going to be looking at positioning themselves more from a transformational perspective. Microsoft on the dynamic side has been an ongoing evolution to really grow that business and also support customers with some of their value-add services and the ecosystem on top of Azure. But that's how we see kind of that mix of vendors that are more impacted by the slowdown in transformation activity and the higher touch model that supports that, and those that can be a little bit more transactional and operate in a more hands-off model in the short term to service customers given all the constraints that their organizations face. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jack to take us through some of the implications in terms of higher touch models driven by the migration to hybrid cloud.
Thanks, Allan. So historically, cloud vendors' interactions with their customers were only for workloads that were hosted in cloud data centers, this being hosted public cloud or hosted private cloud. However, as customers increasingly shift towards hybrid IT models, cloud vendors are having a higher touch as they sell hosted on-premise private cloud offerings to those customers, which requires more collaboration between vendors and customers at the edge, which previously was not really a use case. So the cloud vendors are becoming higher touch in that sense there. And kind of diving a little bit deeper into that, Microsoft has really established itself as a leader in hosted on-prem private cloud with Azure Stack, which started back in 2016. And Azure Stack since then, especially over the past year or couple of years, has evolved into more of a portfolio with new offerings like Azure Stack Edge and Azure Stack HCI. And like I mentioned, hybrid is becoming a very increasingly needed and expected workload for those customers. So having Azure Stack Hub and Azure Stack Edge is something that is going to be used for manufacturing and public sector workloads in terms of IoT and the need for edge use cases in public sector, such as putting a device on tanks or trucks, things of those sorts. And that's actually been seen with the JEDI contract that the Department of Defense had. They mentioned the need for hybrid infrastructure as a service. So Azure Stack and the rest of this portfolio really helps round that out. And Azure Stack HCI is something that is part of the portfolio, but it's not actually a cloud offering. Part of this is branding to make sure that everything sounds cohesive, but it also is better suited to connect with Azure. So this being just a on-premises server that is kind of interconnected with the Azure systems. And also, containers have been something that Microsoft has started to dabble in. Under Satya Nadella, Microsoft is trying to be a little bit more of a vendor agnostic player, but at the same time, they want to keep customers in that all Microsoft environment, hence the hosted public and private cloud, as well as this hosted on-premise private. But there are customers that are deploying in containerized environments, and they need to be able to run those workloads where they need them. And so Microsoft, in order to win those customers, is going to be adding containers to that. And Amazon Web Services, AWS, is taking a similar approach to Microsoft by taking an infrastructure as a service-led strategy. So AWS Outposts is akin to Azure Stack Hub, and that just launched in December of this past year, though. So AWS is a little bit behind Microsoft, trailing in terms of that hosted on-premise private cloud innovation, and it hasn't built out a offering much like Azure Stack Edge, but at the same time, it does have Snowball and those offerings, but they're not quite as robust as the Azure Stack portfolio thus far. And kind of building off of that, I just want to pass it off to my colleague Catie, who can go into IBM and how they're taking more of a hybrid Paas approach.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So kind of as was mentioned, unlike AWS and Microsoft and IBM when they really first got started in the cloud, we're seeing them kind of steer away from the competitive landscape that Microsoft and AWS have created, kind of focusing less on those lower margin infrastructure as a service engagements, although some of that does still flow to IBM, but really capturing more of the opportunity that sits at the hybrid management layer. And of course, this was encouraged by the acquisition of Red Hat, which is nearly a year old now, coming up in July. So with that, we're seeing IBM leverage kind of the Linux and the Kubernetes architecture that they've created in their OpenShift platform. So by placing OpenShift as the underlying architecture, we see IBM really trying to win around the hybrid control plane, kind of commoditizing that layer. And the company's long expertise in data hosting and the things it's done with IBM Cloud Private a couple of years ago, and the really high-touch model of its leading services teams do position it well to capitalize on this opportunity, both on-prem and off. For example, the OpenShift platform has really resonated with customers. There's over 1,700 customers on the platform as of now, the majority of which are still deploying on-prem, about 60%, 40% in the public cloud. So with OpenShift kind of at the core, there are a lot of opportunities for IBM to develop on that, and we've really seen that with these more recent Cloud Pak innovations, and that's opening doors for IBM to really push out more software and more services to customers. And that's something we've seen in their more recent financial results, with cloud revenue growing in the double digits. So in short, with Red Hat, IBM has really pivoted strategies. There are still some dynamics kind of being worked out. We're tracking how these new executive roles will take shape, and if the company can really effectively acquire net new customers and actually take market share. But thus far, the Paas-led hybrid approach that they have taken has potential to be really effective.
Great, thanks, Catie. And looking at Google Cloud, they're actually taking a very similar approach to IBM, taking that hybrid Paas-led strategy. And they launched Anthos back in April 2019, which is more of a portfolio or a suite that includes its GKE on-prem, a couple other offerings for migrations as well. And Google Cloud has been a leader in Kubernetes. It actually was the inventor of the technology. So it's established a mind share as a strong vendor and a strong value proposition around that. and that enables customers to deploy on-prem investments, or this also enables customers to use their on-prem investments because they can deploy Anthos or GKE on-prem on their existing servers while connecting it to Google's public cloud. But IBM has had more of a foothold in the hybrid PaaS space because, as Katie mentioned, the acquisition of Red Hat brought a lot of customers into the fold of IBM. And they also had IBM Cloud Private, which kind of gave them that initial foothold and mind share in the market. So Google Cloud is definitely facing a bit of an uphill battle, but we still think that Anthos is going to be a strong growth area for Google. And more recently, Google's really shown that vendor agnostic strategy it's taking with enabling customers to run workloads on AWS, and that's taking that same Kubernetes PaaS approach, and eventually this will also move on to Microsoft and other vendors that haven't been mentioned. But what we think this really does is it enables customers to leverage Google public cloud or hosted private, either way, to use Google's AI, machine learning areas where it has a strong value proposition, but then also use Azure for other workloads, or AWS SageMaker, things where there's best of breed from each vendor, so that really helps round it out for them. And moving on to our next slide here. One area within hosted on-prem private cloud that's been a strong area of investment recently is around telco, partnering with telco vendors and deploying infrastructure and platform as a service on the telco data centers. So what this does is it brings vendors even closer to the end customer and to telecom operators, pushing these vendors even further into customers' operations and workloads around IoT. So that's something where customers or these vendors are getting a higher touch as well. So looking at Microsoft, taking that same infrastructure as a service-led approach, they deployed or launched Azure Edge Zones. And this is going to be in telecom vendors' data centers, like I mentioned. One of the more notable ones was AT&T, but there were a few other vendors that were mentioned as well when Microsoft launched the offering. And what this does is it reduces latency for 5G workloads because Azure is able to connect to the 5G network and right at the telecom data center or at the edge. So reduces that latency for IoT workloads, which can then move back into the hosted public cloud or private cloud for more broader PaaS services, such as running analytics. And AWS is taking a similar strategy to Microsoft. AWS Wavelength is much like Azure Edge Zones, and their kind of premier partner in this area has been Verizon. And this is still kind of in the infancy stages. They're still building out the tech, and there's a few pilot customers, but it's very much in the early stages. So this shows that it's a technology that's not profitable yet, but they're still investing in it while all of these short-term operational changes need to be taking place for COVID-19. So it's helpful to see that these vendors are continuing to invest for the future while addressing those short-term drawbacks, I should say. And Google Cloud, leveraging Anthos, taking that hybrid PaaS approach, launched Anthos for telecom, taking the same idea of reaching those edge workloads, and also created the global mobile edge compute strategy. And this is something that was kind of notable because Google Cloud historically did not have a very strong messaging to customers when it was really entering the cloud space, trying to attract enterprise customers. G Suite and GCP were a little bit disconnected, and that pushed away some customers from adopting Google Cloud. So under Thomas Kurian and the previous CEO before that, Google has really started to solidify its messaging, and it's now showing with this new strategy that it's prepared to provide enterprises with the IoT needs that they need. And lastly, SAP. They still offer infrastructure as a service, but they've more moved towards a Paas-led and software as a service type vendor. And they're attracting these 5G workloads through their, by partnering with Verizon and integrating Verizon's ThingsPace platform with Leonardo IoT and SAP Edge devices, analytics and compute, as well as some data management offerings. And this is going to better enable SAP to support customers' edge use cases that require connectivity to numerous endpoints with low latency. For example, SAP Edge services alongside Verizon's 5G network enables manufacturing companies to monitor equipment for failures and track products and supply chains for the edge. And more broadly, this will also enable edge use cases such as VR, AR, blockchain, and machine learning.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add that, you know, these lists aren't all inclusive, but IBM could be added here as well because, you know, they're innovating in this space, and we saw that at the Think 2020 virtual event where they announced a few new edge solutions that are built on OpenShift to kind of help customers, alleviate customers from that management component and better enable workloads to run at the edge, and then have that data stored anywhere, either in the public cloud, private cloud, or in the data center. So again, just kind of highlighting, you know, IBM's emphasis on the OpenShift platform to kind of help it become solidified in the edge space and match competitors in that regard. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Nikki, to talk about managed services.
Thank you, Katie. So thank you everyone for joining. I will round out the session by speaking to managed services around the theme of higher touch. Managed services providers have long since played a central role in helping organizations run efficiently, reduce costs, and take care of the tasks and challenges that IT teams did not have the skills or bandwidth to handle themselves, or maybe even both. It's really an understatement to say that every organization is different, and that as a result, the MSP landscape has always to some degree been in a state of flux as factors such as pain points, priorities, budgets, culture, and roadmaps all come into play, among many others. As the MSP market has grown, providers have had to be nimble in their responses to such dynamics and continuously balance and adapting their portfolio of services to stay relevant and meet their customers' varying needs and maintain their competitive advantage. Now, while some of this still holds true, this was in the past, and so as we look to the current state, MSPs really are seeing themselves now on the front lines of the IT battle. They're working side by side with businesses in a much more high-touch way to help keep them up and running and in an unprecedented operating environment, and one that requires a much more high-touch approach with more engagement and collaboration. They've had to refocus and expand their portfolios even more than before to alleviate clients' most critical pain points, assisting in migrating to the cloud and secure environments in the midst of a pandemic. At MSPs, as their portfolio expands, are overall becoming more sophisticated and integral to sustain the vitality of customers' businesses during the crisis. In turn, they will also be critical to help guide companies along the right path safely as they navigate forward. They'll provide operational support to lay the foundation for longer-term sustainability and for many digital transformations. And there are some that would argue this may actually blur the MSP role into one as a trusted advisor in some cases, particularly when it comes to secure migration to the cloud and working with their customers every step along the way. While there has never been a one-size-fits-all use case to work with managed service providers, the pandemic has brought to surface some unifying elements that speak to what pretty much every organization is experiencing today. The influencing factors shown here on the slide are all in many ways tightly interrelated and tethered together. The skill shortages and capacity issues, which may have existed to some degree pre-COVID, have been severely amplified by the pandemic. They are in turn directly related to the sweeping mandate for remote work, which has placed huge unforeseen strains on existing networks. Organizations whose workforces have been scattered overnight have had to turn to MSPs to reduce the burden on internal IT and manage current environments. And now this is especially the case for teams who do not have experience operating in remote environments to start, and let alone ones in times of crisis. And the case is naturally even the most urgent for companies who did not prioritize security in its IT roadmap and really need the life raft that managed service providers can provide. At this point, it's kind of like, we'll build the fire later, but let's just get to shore. Resource constraints combined with workforces spread thinly over different geographies have opened up the floodgates for an onslaught of cyber attacks and breaches at a global magnitude that has never really been experienced before. I think we've all seen this in many different permutations. Managing operations while staving off attacks has proven to be virtually impossible for many organizations, and as a result, the need for services around security that help companies protect their sensitive company data and networks has taken on a high degree of urgency and will likely become a central component of managed service providers' portfolios in both the short and the long-term timeframes. Now, terms like quote-unquote security and privacy are really easy to gloss over at a high level. So I'll spend just a few seconds listing out some of the primary areas that MSP's cyber portfolios include, which are backup, business continuity, and DR. These appear time and time again, and some may argue should be treated as separate categories in and of themselves. Endpoint security, network monitoring and management, and cloud-based app security were all areas cited as primary services sitting under the terms umbrella as well. Now moving on to a study that was recently conducted by TBR. It's a customer study where we were able to place some quantitative data behind these qualitative trends, which really do confirm that security and data location and privacy are top pain points for cloud adoption. And in both these categories, 60% of respondents indicated a plan to employ managed services providers versus augment their own internal teams to address these concerns. And this serves as just another proof point that important mission-critical data is one that the majority of customers would prefer to have managed by IT specialists versus in-house, and sheds light on the growing importance of the roles of managed service providers overall. Now, the building out of an MSP security portfolio goes hand in hand with the surge in the demand for the migration of workloads to the cloud. This holds especially true for the migration of mission-critical workloads that are the most sensitive and vulnerable to attack, and even more so in critical industries such as healthcare and finance. The MSPs that will be the most successful in this area are those established ones with the advantage of long-term client relationships and credibility in the marketplace to extend their IT experience to the cloud. They will be in the best position to capitalize on the pressing need for secure workload migration to the cloud while operating other tasks that rose to the top of the list in the survey, which you can see include areas like usage monitoring, interoperability, as well as billing. Now, to take a step back, cloud migration services, and as I did with security services, is a pretty broad umbrella. So I'd like to mention a few specifics to provide an idea as to what this broad category can encapsulate beyond just migration of apps to the cloud. Managed cloud migration services could include services that prepare a client's system, processes, and culture for the cloud, as well as services that help clients optimize their returns while opening them up for new opportunities. More sophisticated providers are not being confined to migration alone. They've started to refer to the range of services as cloud transformation services, and this aligns with the nomenclature used when talking about overall digital transformation and fits more within longer time periods of transformation for managed service providers who can approach the cloud story with a business-focused methodology and become more of an advisor in the long term. And now, in continuing to think in the long term, when it comes to portfolio expansion, there will invariably remain the need to constantly evolve and strengthen managed services offerings in the area of security, data protection, and privacy, as they will all remain critical to survive in whatever the new abnormal will bring. These will be central components that will anchor the build-out of the MSP's portfolios and cement themselves as trusted partners. But now, in thinking just a bit outside of security, there's one underlying technology I'd like to highlight that will augment a managed service provider's ability to provide a full range of technical services and enhance their overall portfolio. This is automation. Between the shortage of IT talent the relentless security threats, choke networks, and increased customer demand, it's really easy for both customers and managed service providers to be completely overwhelmed. By presenting customers with automation around more simple and decision tree type tasks, managed services providers have the opportunity to grow their business as cloud users look to control costs through services that don't require ongoing human oversight. It is also an indication that managed services providers will be getting out of a reactive relationship with their customers and more into the proactive mindset and just become more sophisticated in general. And I think this again harkens back to more of a role as a trusted advisor in some sort versus just someone who does the operationalizing or the monitoring. Eventually, and this is much more of a future-driven insight, there may also be elements of machine learning and AI that may come into play for smarter automation, especially as customers evolve along their own digital transformation curve. Now, I think it's pretty fitting to end a Cloud is High Touch session with a brief mention of some notable partnership activity, which is probably the most kind of high touch business activity that we can have, and what is going on in the managed services space. The connection between leading cloud vendors and MSPs is becoming closer and closer and more vital with well thought out and executed partnership programs that have clear milestones and very rigorous onboarding and monitoring systems. The leading partner programs include MSPs who are highly skilled at providing full lifecycle solutions to customers in the vendor's cloud. And with these partner programs, there's this notion of the next generation of managed service provider partners who will work within leading vendors' overall partner networks and help customers with planning, design, migration, running, operating, and overall business optimization, excuse me. And the emphasis in all of this is on collaboration, innovation, and growth. So again, this kind of gets back to the notion that managed service providers are integral, they are important, they're expanding their portfolio and will become increasingly embedded, not only to get through the crisis, but in the context of customers' overall digital transformation journeys. And so with that, I will hand the session back over to Allan for a quick recap before we launch into some of the Q&As that you guys may have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so I just wanted to go through some of the things that you should take away from the session and that stood out to me going through and listening to the presentation. First is that the uncertainty that most customers are facing is unprecedented in terms of their business strategy, their IT strategy. And so in a lot of ways, that's put a pause on some of the ongoing initiatives, but also really they're valuing flexibility and the ability to have partners and help to operate in this environment. Second is, in terms of what customers are looking for and valuing in cloud solutions, certainly there's been a focus on innovation and agility. So being able to access new capabilities, some are specific to, like we saw with the COVID-19 impact, a lot of innovation around things that supported the immediate change and shift, as well as a stance that with agility where they're ready to have a stable environment that can adapt to whatever changes might come in the future. And then the last two things around skills, remote capabilities, and automation. So being able to deliver in innovative ways is really important for end customer organizations and the MSPs and the cloud and IT vendors that support them. So I think there's been a lot of change there to react and continue to deliver a high level of support as customers navigate this. And so those are the things that stuck out to me and that you should walk away with. All right, with that, we will go right into the Q&A. So there's been a number of questions submitted. I'll kind of go through and throw out ones to the team, but please continue to submit those, as well as after we close the session, any follow-ups as you get the deck and think about what we've gone through. We're happy to respond afterwards. All right, so the first question is around the higher cost of some cloud workloads, and is that accelerating repatriation to on-prem or slowing movement to cloud initiatives? So I think in some ways, we started the presentation looking at some of the more mission-critical, stable workloads, and in some ways, those are not always the best suited to cloud. You see that with SAP's traction around S/4HANA. A lot of that activity has been on-prem today, and if you're going to have a stable level of infrastructure requirement, pretty predictable workloads, a lot of customers for that suite in particular are opting to have that on-prem. So there's certainly cost plays a factor, but there's also a lot of other considerations, I'll say, with network and latency and all those things that go into evaluating the more important workloads. So there's always been a spectrum. I think there has been, we mentioned some of the project delays. Yeah, a lot of those are things that could potentially go to cloud, but there's going to be transformation involved, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. So there's certainly a delay, and a lot of the existing systems are going to have to do for now, and they're going to push out those decisions and those new investments and potential cloud transformation. So in some ways, it does slow some of the cloud migration activity, at least in the short term. When we look at the feedback, clearly there's more intent to accelerate adoption of new solutions and move to cloud in some cases. So longer term, there could be some evening out and some making up for delayed decisions today. But in a lot of ways, customers are more focused on innovation and agility, as we've kind of discussed. All right, let's see. The next question is around, on slide 7, we laid out some of the hybrid technologies, and there's a question about VMware Cloud Foundation, what role that plays, and should that be represented on the slide. That was not an all-inclusive, exhaustive view into the platforms that support hybrid, and I'll have Catie Merrill jump in with just some comments about where we see VMware in that spectrum and the role that they're playing.
Yeah, definitely. So these slides are not all inclusive, but absolutely VMware Cloud Foundation could be added to that slide. I think the key takeaway is that, VMware doesn't really quite stack up in terms of competitors just in sheer volume, because if you look at slide 7, we're benchmarking them against Microsoft and IBM. But as we know, VMware is a very pervasive brand, and its expertise in the virtualization layer makes it a rising force. So the things they're doing with VCF and with Pivotal do kind of put them in the same space as Azure and OpenShift, and kind of a race to capture that control plane layer. And especially the more recent stuff they're doing around this Tanzu initiative, which is really about enabling modern applications, kind of initiating that vendor agnostic approach so you can run Kubernetes anywhere. And from a vendor perspective, that's really interesting because that's what Red Hat OpenShift's selling point is. So you could kind of justify that what VMware is doing is in many ways a counter to the OpenShift IBM Cloud Pak kind of play. So it will be interesting to see what these vendors do going forward.
All right, great. Let's see. There's a question around the difference between consulting and advisory. For our taxonomy, we're lumping those together. So we're not differentiating between those two. However, when you look at in practice, some of we are looking at vendor share across those spaces and cloud consulting. And in a lot of ways, the vendor that's recognizing the revenue and doing the activity will determine whether it's kind of cross-solution advisory, or whether it's really more kind of a pre-sales or consulting activity that's more tied to a specific offering or vendor. And so, just kind of looking at what vendors are represented, their share, those types of things, I think gives a little perspective on, technically whether it would be consulting or advisory function. But in general, we categorize them under the same heading. Let's see. Around most of the cloud providers have a data exit tax. How do you see that impacting a multi-cloud solution such as Google's Anthos? I can start on this, and then any of my colleagues can jump in. In terms of the multi-cloud activity that we're seeing, I think most customers are not looking at it as a short-term commitment to any one cloud where they make adjustments or shift environments on a very frequent basis. So I think it certainly is evaluated in terms of that total cost and having some level of flexibility and agility. But for most of the interviews and research that we've done, enterprises are looking at really kind of longer term decisions around if they're going to portion out different workloads on different cloud environments, really what the right fit is from a longer term basis. So I'd probably say at least 3-year horizon to keep the workloads in that environment and not incur any exit taxes or any other migration challenges that come along with making more frequent changes to the environment. And a lot of multi-cloud environments come from either departmental decisions or acquisitions that are being integrated and brought in. In those cases, it's, IT is a byproduct of what the real intent is there from a business perspective. So I think that plays into some of those multi-cloud decisions as well. I don't know if anybody else on my team has additions to that perspective.
Yeah, this is Nikki. I'm just kind of thinking, right, just real quick, I'm thinking back to our customer study that we produced, and there were quite a bit of feedback from the customers who we actually interviewed, not just around the survey, that in terms of like the decision making on the line of business versus IT, that there was going to become the greater cohesion and alignment of decision making, and that kind of some of this fragmentation around hybrid clouds that sometimes is a decision that people reach as one, but will actually become more of like a strategic component of the teams working together from a decision making standpoint, which ultimately leads to what happens operationally down the road.
Okay. Let's see, another question in reference to slide 8 with SAP and Verizon. Do you see synergy in efforts that include AWS Wavelength and AWS?
Yeah, I can jump into that. So I definitely think that there will be synergies between SAP and AWS around 5G, particularly with both of them partnering with Verizon and using Verizon kind of their testing partner as they move into the technology and prep it for general availability eventually. And that's pretty much like, if you look back at their previous relationships, SAP has been a very important partner to AWS with S/4HANA workloads and migrating those from on-prem to the cloud. And I think that type of hybrid partnership is going to be pushed into this 5G space as well, running on AWS's servers or infrastructure. SAP will be able to provide those analytics for customers and integrate it back with their broader SAP on AWS environments in AWS's public cloud. And
great.
Just one other thing to add to that is I think that the partnership will likely happen between Microsoft and SAP as well. That's a key partner for both of the infrastructure vendors. So I think SAP will take the same approach of kind of being agnostic to the infrastructure as the service vendor.
Okay, great. Let's see. There's a question about some of the programmatic approaches cloud service providers are taking to target some of the enterprise workload migrations, like SAP. So I can start in, and then certainly anyone else in the team can join. Yeah, I mean, it's been about developing. I think for those enterprise use cases, the most important thing for customers is to have proven use cases that are relevant to their vertical, that are relevant to their business problem, and kind of a demonstrated capability to come in and use cloud resources to target those more mission critical type solutions. And so that's the area that's been lacking in a lot of ways. It just takes time to develop that track record and have organizations take that risk and be out ahead in terms of other peers in their industry to rely on cloud for some of those more important services. So in the meantime, developing tight partnerships, being a preferred cloud provider. There's been a lot of kind of alliance certification, designation activity, and building towards that longer track record of customers that have reduced expense, realized benefit, and had a stable solution to support their business. That's the progress that I've seen to date. Anybody else on the team can join in.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Okay, great. That's the last question that we can take in today's session. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining. There's been a number of requests to have the deck, and we will respond to that. We will email the deck as an attachment to everybody who's asked. So please, we'll leave the window open for a bit. Let us know if you want to get the deck or have any last questions. And we look forward to connecting with you again soon. The next webinar in our series, we always do these on Wednesdays. So next Wednesday, June 24th, the title is Advisory-Led Discussions Help Quantum Computing Emerge in Customers' Transformation-Centric Conversations. So a discussion around quantum computing, as well as the consulting that goes into them. Thank you, everybody, again for joining, and have a great day.